Hello everyone and welcome back to the Airthings Masters. We are in the knockout phase of the tournament. After 3 days of the preliminaries, 4 players had to drop out of the tournament, and here in the quarterfinals we have Magnus Carlsen versus Daniil Dubov. So the master faces the student, and already we have a very exciting game. So without further ado, let's check it out. Everything is the same in the tournament, the time format is the same, and the games can only get more and more interesting. So without further ado, Magnus with the white pieces opens with e4. We have e5 from Dubov, not going for the Sicilian this game. Knight to f3, that's not a knight. Knight to c6 and bishop to b5. So Magnus goes for the Ruy Lopez. We have a6, Morphy's defense, and the bishop to a4. So this has all been played thousands of times. Knight to f6, d3, and now b5, attacking that bishop. We have bishop back to b3 and bishop to c5, sort of an Anderson variation of Morphy's defense. We have c3. Later on you can advance the pawn to d4. Also you can hide this bishop to c2 if needed. And Dubov strikes in the center with d5. So what do you do here? Magnus first captures once. We have captures, and now Magnus just castles. Here Dubov castles as well, and rook to e1. And now there's a double attack on this e5 pawn, and there is one game in the database where bishop to g4 was played. Kind of makes sense, as you don't want to allow knight captures on e5. But Dubov being Dubov, he plays bishop to e6 instead, and he offers the e5 pawn. Now, can you capture the e5 pawn? Of course not, because if you capture it, obviously you don't capture with the rook, because then you just lose material. But if you capture with the knight, it's not much better, because bishop captures on f2 with check. This is what Dubov had in mind, and after king captures, just knight captures on e5. After rook captures on e5, queen f6 check picks up the rook, so obviously not the greatest idea for white. So Magnus instead just continues developing. He did consider the position for quite a bit. He played knight b to d2 afterwards, and now comes knight to f4. We have d4 by Magnus, because the d3 pawn is under attack twice from the knight and the queen. So he takes advantage of this knight being only defended by this e5 pawn, and he defends it with the d4. And now this works for him. E captures on d4, and now knight to e4 by Magnus with a double attack on the knight here and on the bishop on c5. This is how he wins back his material. Problem is for Magnus, he's already down to 7 minutes and 30 seconds, whereas Dubov is almost up to full time. He's around 14 minutes and some seconds. So here both of these pieces are attacked. So bishop d6 defending defending the knight, and now Magnus just grabs back his pawn. So c captures on d4, and here Dubov does some trading. First bishop captures on b3, queen captures on b3, and now rook to e8. Just developing this rook to a nice open e-file. Bishop captures on f4 by Magnus with bishop captures, and now rook 8 to d1. And Magnus has completed his development, asking Dubov, what do you play here? And Dubov goes for queen to d7. He develops the queen. The rooks are now connected. As they say in PogChamps, they've become bros for life. And here comes knight to c5 for Magnus. Now the queen is under attack, and also there's some pressure on this a6 pawn. And here Dubov can choose to just trade, for example, captures, and then bring the queen over to f5, which is perfectly fine. But he decides to offer a pawn to Magnus by playing queen to f5 right away. And now, as you can see, the a6 pawn is very weak. You can either capture on e8, allow capture, and then capture the a6 pawn, or you can do it the way Magnus did it, just capture the pawn right away. So knight captures on a6, and here Dubov just goes back, bishop to d6. And now what can Magnus do here? Magnus brings back the knight, knight to c5, and now Dubov trades. Rook captures on e1, rook captures on e1, and now knight captures on d4. This was Dubov's idea. We have knight captures on d4 and queen captures on c5 now. So Magnus needs to grab one more pawn, otherwise this was all for nothing. And the situation on the clock is, well, very favorable for Dubov. It's 4 minutes for Magnus. Is very favorable for Magnus. Here Dubov was extremely low on time. Magnus was 4 minutes on the clock, whereas Dubov had only 10 seconds on the clock. But as it is a rapid tournament, you get 10 seconds every time you make a move. So here Dubov quickly, after Carlsen grabbed the pawn here, Dubov played bishop to e5 now, and Magnus just brought back the knight. And now you have this very weird position where Magnus already has a passed A pawn. He's a lot better on time, and Dubov needs to make a move because the clock is ticking, and he's constantly surviving on those extra 10 seconds he makes when he makes a move. So here, although a lot of moves are possible, maybe bishop to d4, for example, going after the f2 pawn, he just grabs the knight on c3, saying he will hold the endgame, as there will be a lot less possibilities for Magnus to go for. So here B captures on c3. You could also capture with the queen, but then it's just too easy for Dubov to draw this. King f8, you prevent the checkmate, and now rook e2 defending. Again, you have to play this endgame being down a pawn, but you will probably be able to hold it. So here, instead, after bishop captures on c3, we have B captures on c3 by Magnus, and now g6, getting rid of any back rank weaknesses, because after the rook moves, you don't want to get checkmated. And now Magnus starts pushing his pass pawn. We have a4, and now rook to d8 by Dubov. We have queen to c2. Dubov wants to bring the rook to d2 and then, checkmate Magnus here with queen f2. So queen c2, preventing the rook lift, and now king to g7. We have g3, Magnus also creates some breathing room for his king, and rook to d6 now, preparing rook f6 again to go after the f2 pawn. So rook to e3, Magnus blocks the queen, this way also adds additional protection to the e3 pawn, and now queen to d5. And now it's a bit of a dangerous battery Dubov has here. So Magnus, while he could opt for some moves like h3 or h4, Magnus goes for the queen trade immediately, and he will now try to torture Dubov as much as he can in this, sort of equalish rook endgame. But it's, like I said, very hard with so little time on the clock. So here Dubov can decline the queen trade, but he decides to trade, captures, and now rook c6. He wants to grab the c3 pawn, and Magnus says, okay, I'm going to continue pushing my own pass pawn. So Dubov grabs on c3, and now rook to a4. You always have to put a rook behind the pass pawn, and now you have to push that pass pawn. So Dubov's next few moves are a must. He needs to stop that pass pawn. Rook b3, a6 by Magnus, rook to b8. You have to play it like this, and now you could push a7 right away. Magnus first starts by improving the position of his king. King f1, king to f6, and king to e2. We have king to e6, king to d3 now. King to d5, blocking Carlsen's king from advancing further up the board, and now rook to d4 check. King to c6, and now rook to c4 with check. King d6, and now rook to f4, going after the f7 pawn. Dubov defends, and Magnus goes back. Rook to d4 with check. King c6 and rook to c4 with check. And now there's no clear way of how to look for advantage here. Magnus just needs to try and wear out Dubov as he tries to get him as low on time as possible. So here, king back to d6, king to d4 now. Magnus gains some more squares for his king, and now rook to a8. Dubov goes after the pass pawn. Rook to a4, Magnus defends it, and again king back to c6. We have rook back to a2, and king to b6 now. And here Magnus just goes king to d5. The problem for Dubov is he can never capture this pawn, because if captures, king to c6 just wins the game for Magnus. He will win the pawn next, and then just shift his king over there, grab all of the pawns, and that's just the game. So instead, we have rook to d8 check by Dubov, king to e6, and now comes rook back to a8. We have rook to b2 check, now asking, do you want to go back? King to c6, which probably would have been a safer option for Dubov, but Dubov decides that it's actually okay to capture the pawn, which it is, only it's a bit more complicated to play. So Carlsen goes back, king to d5, and now rook to e8, preparing to either defend the pawn or try and harass the white king from behind. Here, king to c6, trying to, checkmate Dubov with rook to a2, because if the pawn is defended, then rook to a2 is checkmate. Of course, Dubov will not fall for that, that's why he played rook to e8. He checks Carlsen's king, rook to e6 with check, and now Carlsen picks up the pawn. And again, the material on the board is still completely equal, but Dubov's king completely cut off from the board with this rook on the b file. So here Dubov tries f4. He wants to trade off some of the pawns here on the king side, so it would be much easier to hold the draw. But Magnus goes king d7, attacks his rook, rook back to e1, and now not trading or anything like that. You could grab a pawn here, but then you'd have doubled f pawns, and it'd be much easier for the black rook to pick them off one by one. So here, G4 by Magnus. Now saying that if rook to H1, which was played in the game, you could defend it with a move like F3, then the H pawn will be defended by the rook, but Magnus first goes king to C6. He finds a very sneaky plan now, again threatening checkmate. Dubov defends with king to A5, we have king C5, again threatening checkmate, king A4, and now Magnus finds rook to B4 with check. This is how Magnus picks up the F4 pawn without ruining his pawn structure. So king A3, and now rook captures on F4. We have rook captures on H2, material still completely equal, and now rook back to F7. Now Magnus will start pushing the F pawn and try and create a passed F pawn. And Dubov can at any point push H5 and create a passed pawn of his own. First, he starts improving the position of his king. King B3. We have F4 by Magnus, king to C3. Now the king is in a much better position than when he was on A3, but Magnus still pushes with F5. We have G captures on F5 by Magnus. Now both of them with passed pawns, and here Dubov needs to play very precise moves. For example, we're just going to show one line that works for him: king to D3. For example, king D5, king E3, king E5, and now king to F3 will allow Dubov to hold this position. For example, F6, you're going to play rook H5 check, king to kick the king away, king to D6, now king to F4, and after rook to C7, making room for the pawn to be pushed, just rook F5. And now you're guarding this pawn and you're going to start pushing your own pawn. For example, F7, you're going to play H5, and now after king here, preparing to queen the pawn, you can just give up the rook, and now, of course, white will also have to give up, for example, his rook to stop your pawn at some point, like this. Really, it can go either way, but at some point white will also have to give it up. So here, king to D3, a viable option for Dubov. However, Dubov played rook to A2 instead, and now it simply doesn't work. So feel free to pause the video and win this game for Magnus while I give you a couple of seconds. So for those of you who were able to do it, congratulations on finding either of the two winning moves, or rather even more of them. King to D5 is winning, the F6 right away is winning, and even the rook to F8 is winning. So a lot of moves are winning here for Magnus, because rook to A2 was such a suboptimal move that pretty much any move you made was winning in this position. So congratulations to everyone. So king to D5 was the move that Magnus chose, and now we have rook to A5 check by Dubov. King to E4, and now rook to A4 check. King E5, and now Dubov started pushing his passed pawn, but now it's a much different position than the one that we've shown. The king and rook are much further away than in the variation that we've shown. So H4, F6, we have rook to A5 with check, king E6, rook A6 check, king F5, rook to A5 check, and now king to G6, and now rook to A4. Again, defending the pawn here, but just F7 by Magnus. We have rook to G4 check, king to F5, and now rook to G1, preparing to play rook to F1 check. For example, if you're not careful, you bring a queen into the game, rook F1 check, king has to move, and now you pick up the queen. Will result in a draw. So here instead, after this rook to G1 move, we have rook captures on H4, the simplest way to win the game. And it was in this position on move 72 that Daniil Dubov resigned the game, and the game 1 goes to Magnus Carlsen. So we'll see if Dubov can get back into this match, and will he be able to retaliate at some point. Here, of course, you resign, because after rook to F1 check, you just block, and regardless of what black plays, you bring a queen into the game on your next move. So really a great game to start off their match. Dubov playing again in great style, beautiful opening, beautiful. That bishop to E6 move was really exciting, offering Magnus to make a mistake such early on in the game. But Magnus was able to take it into an endgame, and then with Dubov having little time on the clock, he defended perfectly, but Magnus will just drag it on, and Magnus knows that you will make a mistake before he does. That's how Magnus rolls. So yeah, that's the game. Sure, hope you guys enjoyed it. I'm sure Dubov hasn't, but you know, there are more games in the match. I would like to thank Andrew Martin, Michael Castagno, Luis Souza, Paul Sampson, and Matev Granda for a contribution to my channel. Thank you a lot. I really appreciate it. As usual, you can check 2 of my previous videos here. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you soon, continuing the coverage of the Airthings Masters, checking up on your wonderful suggestions and whatever else happens in the chess world. Thank you all. I will see you soon, and have an excellent rest of your day.